Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again. Tonight, we're going to look at two of our five themes of geography, starting with place. Place is described as the unique human and physical characteristics of a location. Now, in common understanding, place is often used as a synonym for location. But in geography, place refers to the attributes and values we individually associate with a location. So let's start tonight by looking at some of the characteristics that make a location unique. We start with site, which is the unique internal physical character of a place, including its absolute location and spatial character. You might have heard that focus on internal, which means that we're talking about what is actually in a particular place, not its outside relationships. And let's add a little more to this definition, because reducing site to only its physical character leaves out a lot of the important human characteristics that make a place unique. So in our notes, let's change this definition a bit to physical and human character of a place. Now, site can include a lot of things. Things like absolute location, so the latitude and longitude of a place. Its climate, water, topography, soil quality and content, the types of vegetation, and we could even extend that to types of agriculture found in an area. And this is where the physical and the human elements cross over. Because most types of agriculture are associated with certain climate conditions. But agriculture doesn't happen by accident. It's a human undertaking. So other human actions that make a place unique can include things like the cultural landscape, which is the imprint that we leave on the physical environment. That can include agriculture, but it also includes what we call our built environment. Think about the Las Vegas skyline. Is that unique? Can we see this built characteristics of Las Vegas, the human imprint on the landscape? Can we see this skyline anywhere else on Earth? No, it's unique. So if site characteristics include the internal elements, then situation deals with the external characteristics. Here's our definition. Situation is the external attributes of a place relative to another place. So relative location and situation have much in common. And if you remember from our conversation last lecture, we talked about connectivity and accessibility. Those two factors contribute to both relative location, but also the situation of a place. And situation helps us understand why an area is more important or less important within a certain context. For example, Singapore is important due to the fact that it's situated in a major shipping passage in Southeast Asia called the Strait of Malacca. Now, let me ask, what would happen if most global trade went from using container ships to some kind of matter transporter that could transport goods around the world in a matter of seconds? Do you think Singapore would be as important? Probably not. And that's because its importance is based on an external characteristic. In this case, the fact that we ship goods around the world on big container ships. And Singapore is situated on the second busiest shipping lane in the world. Now, If you think my matter transporter example is ridiculous, and that's fair, I had to use The Simpsons to find a picture of a matter transporter. Let's look into the past. A historical example would be Timbuktu, which was the center of the Trans-Saharan trade, a massive overland trade network that dominated from the 13th to the 16th centuries. But then maritime trade, or trade over oceans and bodies of water, became dominant. Now, Timbuktu has a population of about 50,000 people. That's less than 20% the population of Henderson, Nevada. So the important note to end this slide is that situation can change drastically and sometimes quickly. Site characteristics can change too, but they don't typically change as dramatically or as quickly. So now, let's have a quick conversation about a concept called sense of place. The idea of sense of place is that a place is special. It has meaning and emotional attachment. That attachment can be related to important events. So let's talk about a couple examples. What attachment do you think people have to Rome in Italy? When I think of Rome, I think of the Colosseum. I think of the Roman Forum. I think of St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. I think of statues and art. But my attachment to Rome is as a tourist. How do you think that attachment changes if you lived there? Are those the most important things about the city for a resident of the city? How might your sense of place be affected if you were a Catholic and thinking of Rome? How would it be different if you were Buddhist? Different places are important to different people. And more importantly, the same place can mean a lot of different things depending on who you talk to. So, I want to ask, what is your sense of place, your attachment to Las Vegas? That helps to make it unique to you. So, jot down in your notes, what is your sense of place? What's your attachment to Las Vegas? When I was younger, I didn't really like Las Vegas. I moved here when I was in second grade, and I swore that after high school, I was moving back to Michigan. But then I met some of my best friends here. I met my wife here. I got married here. Both of my boys were born here. I teach at the same high school I graduated from. My sense of place, my attachment, is a lot stronger than it used to be. This is a nice flowchart that describes sites and situation characteristics that help to make a place unique. It even includes some of those elements of spatial analysis from our very first lecture of the year, not to mention that because we're using a flowchart, we're thinking with space, as well as elements of scale from our second lecture. So this is a really good review slide. Place names can also help to establish a unique character for a place. We call those place names toponyms. Toponyms are the name given to a portion of Earth's surface, just a fancy name for name. The names or labels that we assign to a particular place is part of that sense of place concept we just talked about. The decision to label a place with a certain name describes what is important in that area. Why do you think the most common place name in the United States is Washington? And then there are areas that were former Spanish colonies or part of Mexico that show the influence of Spanish in their names, like Las Vegas, which means the meadows in Spanish, or the importance of the Catholic faith. San Diego means Saint Diego. So, let's see if you can guess the important history, culture, or feature associated with each of these toponyms. Go ahead and put those guesses in your notes. Salt Lake City. What do you think it's next to? How about Pikes Peak? Can you guess who was the important person that climbed that mountain? Side note, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike actually failed to summit the Grand Peak, as he called it. So calling it Pikes Peak is really just a good marketing job. How about Iowa? Can you guess the group of people who live there? If you guessed the Iowa tribe, you were right. And notice some of the other Native American tribes who were located nearby. The Dakota Sioux, the Missouri tribe, and the Illini. And since place names are part of the attachment that people have to a particular place, they can engender some strong feelings. So let's talk about some common toponyms that are mistaken for one another. England is part of the island known as Great Britain, and they share that island with Wales and Scotland. Now, those three nations join with Northern Ireland as part of the modern country, the United Kingdom. But Northern Ireland shares the island of Ireland with another country, the Republic of Ireland. And these islands collectively are known as the British Isles. Aren't toponyms fun? Shifting gears now, our next theme of geography is going to look at human-environment interaction. And that refers to the reciprocal relationship between people and the environments that they inhabit. And we begin with a major component of human life, and that is culture. Culture is the body of customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits that together constitute a group's distinct tradition. Now, those customary beliefs that we refer to are what we often typically associate with culture, things like language and religion. Social forms would be the ways that people conduct themselves in a society. Like, how much respect do you give your elders? Is the society matriarchal or patriarchal? Those are social forms. And then material traits are all the physical elements of culture. The stuff, things like buildings and clothing, books and food. Now, an important feature of culture is that it is a learned collective behavior rather than something we are born with. We are taught these beliefs, social forms, and material traits. So cultural ecology then is the multiple interactions and relationships between a culture and the natural environment. To simplify that, cultural ecology is the study of human-environment interaction. That's what we want to remember. It's the study of human-environment interaction. How humans and the environment influence one another. And cultural ecology is important. That study is important because different cultural groups modify the natural landscape in different ways. It may be different depending on regions. Groups in rainforests may treat their environment differently than groups that live in the Arctic. And groups may modify their landscape differently based on their beliefs. Which then leads us into our theories on the ways that humans and environments influence each other. I'll tell you guys first off, I would anticipate a question dealing with either of these topics. Whether it's a multiple choice question, which is probably a little more likely, or an FRQ, we need to know the difference between these topics. So in your notes, put a star, exclamation points, dollar signs, mind-blown emojis, it doesn't matter. We want to make sure we remember these two topics and the differences between them. Environmental determinism is the view that the natural environment has a controlling influence over various aspects of human life, including cultural development. Notice the end there. Notice the cultural development. Essentially, what this theory means is that humans are clay, and we are molded by the environment. Really, the key message in the theory of environmental determinism is that the environment determines. Or use whatever synonym you want. The environment controls human development, human culture. The environment exclusively shapes humans and their development. It doesn't matter. What matters is, in this theory, the environment does it alone. Possibilism, on the other hand, is the theory that the physical environment may set limits on human actions, but people have the ability to adjust to the physical environment and choose a course of action from many alternatives. All those key words, may, adjust, choose, many alternatives, all those key words point to different options. So possibilism is about possibilities, plural, multiple options, multiple avenues. So let's look at some visual support. One of the approved textbooks does a really good job of visualizing these differences. And so I love this explanation. Again, environmental determinism, there is no flexibility. There are no options. There is only the environment and the path that determines the development of a culture. Now, the theory of possibilism, though, argues that the environment may set limits that offers possibilities and cultures develop as a result. So the biggest thing here, make the note, environmental determinism, the environment controls it. Possibilism, there are possibilities. Now, possibilism theorizes that there are possibilities that may arise based on the limits that are presented by nature. But the possibility of different avenues provides the opportunity for different interpretations of this theory. So let's start with environmental perception. Under this theory, humans and human choice are based on their perception of what nature is rather than what it actually is. Now, this sounds kind of tricky, so let's look at an example. Natural hazards are things like tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, things like that. These natural hazards become natural disasters when people are affected by them. And some cultures view these natural disasters as acts of God or an angry God or gods, or retribution for some misdeeds done by the people. Other cultural groups see them as features of the natural environment that are unattached to human actions. Other groups of people believe that's a primary role for governments to protect people, so natural hazards don't become natural disasters. Still, others believe that natural hazards can be solved by technology. So the perception of the environment is the important element in terms of how cultures develop differently, at least within this one example. On the other end of the spectrum, away from environmental determinism, would be the idea that humans are the modifiers. This idea maintains that the environment is bent to the will of humans rather than the other way around. One of the approved textbooks illustrates this with the idea of ecofeminism. The textbook argues that women are better ecologists and environmentalists than men. The theory states that women have been the gatherers, the gardeners, the childbearers, and generally the nurturers of family and home. So women, in other words, were the better protectors. Men, on the other hand, were the hunters, the fishermen, the warriors, and the clearers of forest, actions more often associated with destruction rather than preservation. And as with all of these theories, there's a degree of debate. But this example is interesting because it emphasizes that gender differences can have an impact on the natural world. Another important proponent of humans' influence on the physical environment was Carl Sauer. He was a famous geographer and coined the term the cultural landscape, which we mentioned earlier and apparently became an important concept within human geography. Based on the concept that humans can modify their environment, Sauer argued that we leave our fingerprint on the physical earth. That's what the cultural landscape is, our fingerprint. It's the visible imprint that we leave on the physical landscape. And that couldn't happen within environmental determinism. That is possibilism. And so if we can alter the landscape, can we protect it, preserve it? The concept of sustainability is the belief that humans should use the Earth's renewable and non-renewable natural resources in a way so that there will be resources available for future generations. And the concept of sustainability is directly related to possibilism. If we envision environmental determinism again, how could we possibly protect something or harness anything more than what the environment permits us to do? If there was urban sprawl or the horizontal growth of cities and it's reducing our agricultural land, okay, let's build gardens and other green spaces on rooftops. Let's use an example that's a little closer to home. Have you ever driven to California? As you cross state line, you get out into the desert where there aren't really any towns, no agriculture, just desert. Why? Well, the environmental determinist answer would argue that it's because the environment is too difficult for human activity to thrive. Except if you've noticed, we use these huge, empty, flat stretches of desert to build huge solar arrays, to harness the sun's energy for electricity. We found a way to use this space. That's possibilism. And if we can work to protect the physical environment, then every decision that derives from that is part of possibilism. Wind farms, solar arrays, green roofs, even the decision to drive electric cars. And we talk about sustainability throughout the year as major components of units from population to politics, from development to urbanization to agriculture. Environmental determinism argues that there is a limited amount of land that can be used to cultivate certain crops. Rice tends to need abundant water and very moderate temperatures on flat parcels of land to plant seedlings into. Possibilism argues that we could take hillsides, carve giant flat steps into them called terraces to make more rice paddies. This is a real-world example of sustainability because the terracing of hillsides increases available farmland, what we will call arable land, to feed more people, while also preventing soil erosion on hillsides and offering a natural, gravity-fed form of irrigation. And because both environmental determinism and possibilism are theories, there are also criticisms that both schools of thought face. Critics of environmental determinism argue that it's too simplistic, that the world does not necessarily have a passive cause and effect relationship between the environment and humans. We could also note that climates that are similar do not necessarily produce the exact same cultural beliefs, forms, and traits. Finally, this theory was used to argue that certain regions were superior and others inferior. And because the physical environment caused culture, there were certain cultures that were superior and others that were inferior. This ethnocentric approach made the argument that the most productive regions of the world were the temperate ones. But when you look back in history, where civilization began, the hearts of civilization, the temperate regions were not what environmental determinists claimed they were. Now, possibilism has its share of criticisms as well. First off, it doesn't completely disprove the influence that the environment has on human culture. While there are limits, those limits are more broad, but they're still limits. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, for discussions that we will have in the future, there's an argument that humans' ability to overcome the limits set by the environment is based on the available technology and countries' ability to afford that technology. To come back to sustainability and the topic of climate change, green roofs, solar arrays, wind farms, and carbon capture technology already exist, but that technology is expensive. So the countries that can least afford it may feel the effects of climate change first and most acutely. So our ability to create additional possibilities from the physical environment is often tied to an individual country's level of development. And that's where we'll end tonight. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I'll see you back in class.